Good evening. Can I welcome all of you very warmly indeed, and thank you for braving the virus and all sorts of other things. Thank you very much for coming. Before we begin properly, may I give a couple of notices? The first, very sadly, Dr. Susan Carpenter, whom most of us would have known, died on the 29th of January. And she was a member of the club, and very sad indeed that she died so suddenly. After this meeting, the next one will be on the 9th of April, and Dr. Ray Perman is going to speak on the financial ruin of Sir Walter Scott and how he got out of it. And Ray Perman is the author of The Rise and Fall of the City of Money, A Financial History of Edinburgh. So that is on the 9th of April. The other advance notice is that our annual dinner is on the 7th of May, and Lee tells me that there are still 17 tickets left. So now is the time to buy these precious tickets before they're all sold out. And the dinner will be in this room. And Murray Pittock will be giving his presidential address, and Murray will be very good and interesting, so please think about the dinner. Now, can I introduce our speaker this evening? You'll already see her topic on the screen, a very curious collection, the Abbotsford Book of Deeds, Dr. Margaret Connolly. Dr. Connolly is a senior lecturer in medieval studies, and she's director of the St Andrews Institute in Medieval Studies. After completing an MA and a PhD at the University of St Andrews, Dr. Connolly took up a lectureship in medieval and Renaissance English at the University College of Cork. And she was Assistant Dean of Arts there between 96 and 99. She became a senior lecturer, and she also was a Government of Ireland visiting fellow at Clare Hall in Cambridge. Dr. Connolly is a general editor of the Middle English Texts series published by Winter in Heidelberg, and she's also a general editor of the Medieval Journal published by Brepols. She's chair of the advisory board of the Index of Middle English Prose, and she serves on the editorial board of the Journal of the Early Book Society. Her specialities are Middle English language and lit, and she has expertise in the areas of paleography and book history, medieval translation, post-medieval reception of medieval texts, 19th century Chaucer scholarship, and the development of library collections. Dr. Connolly, thank you very much indeed for coming from St Andrews, and we look forward very much to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very conscious of how often the word medieval came up there, and feel slightly like a fish out of water speaking to a gathering whose interests are connected with Walter Scott. So I was glad to hear the 19th century mentioned at the end there, and one or two of my more modern interests. So I do hope that what I've got to say tonight will be sufficiently connected with Walter Scott to interest you. I expect all of you have been to Abbotsford, and if you have, you might have seen this item on display. It's in the permanent exhibition in the visitor centre in a case dedicated to Scott the antiquary. What it looks like from the outside is a book that's had far too many things stuffed inside it, leaving the contents all bulging out at one side. But actually, what you're looking at is only the shell of a book. It was a copy of a 17th century book, a popular prose romance called A Tragi-Comical History of Our Times, under the borrowed names of Lysander and Callista. The text was originally written in French and then translated into English, and this copy was printed in London in 1635. All that remains of the Abbotsford copy are 2 full pages, one at the start and one at the end, and just the stubs of all the pages in between. In other words, we have this book's original covers, stiff boards covered with leather, but its printed paper contents have been disemboweled so that the book's outer framework can be reused as a binding for something else. Now housed within it is a collection of documents that are written not on paper but on parchment. These are medieval charters. They're written in Latin. They almost all relate to the manor of Garbaldisham in Norfolk. Each charter has been pasted onto the stub of a page in the former printed book, and many of the charters still have their original seals attached, now protruding and clattering about at the side of the book. Got ahead of myself there. So together, this is a very unusual amalgamation of different things. Manuscript and print, parchment and paper, medieval and modern. And its contents connect us with very different subjects. 17th century French literature translated into English, and English land transactions recorded in Latin from the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, all of which entirely justifies Scott's own description of it as a very curious collection. Over the next half hour, I'm going to take you on a journey tracing this object's movements, starting with Scott's acquisition of it, and then, with a few inevitable gaps, taking its story back over 500 years. And as we go back in time, we'll be moving south across the border from Abbotsford down to East Anglia. We'll be following a detective trail of what academics and archivists call provenance evidence, using inscriptions and clues that can be found in the book object itself. A bit like that family history programme, Who Do You Think You Are? Except in this case, we're following a book, and the questions we'll be asking are essentially, where have you been? How did you get here? And most fundamentally, who made you? So we start in 1824, when Walter Scott was 53 years old. As you all know, probably much better than me, by this stage in his life, Scott was very much a public figure. He'd organised events to celebrate George IV's visit to Scotland in 1822. He'd been created a baronet. He was a highly successful novelist. The financial crash of 1826, which you're going to hear about next month, was still in the future. And in 1824, Scott was in the process of building Abbotsford. The second part of the house, with the library, would be completed the following year. Scott didn't start writing his journal until 1825, but we can reconstruct many details of his life from his correspondence. And amongst his many letters is this one, written in the autumn of 1824 to his neighbour, William Riddle. Dear Sir, accept my best thanks for the very curious collection of charters and seals which you have done me the honour to transfer to my bookshelves. I shall set a very high value on it, both on account of the curiosity of the collection and the kindness of the donor. I am very truly, dear Sir, your obliged and humble servant. This polite little thank you note records Riddle's gift of the object to Scott. and the gift is also memorialised in a label pasted on the inside front cover of the book. On that label, which is set vertically, and which looks a bit like a label on a parcel, William Riddle wrote, "To Sir Walter Scott, Baronet of Abbotsford, from his old and faithful friend, William Riddle. Cavers Car, 5th of November, 1824. The adjective old in the centre there might simply refer to Riddle's greater age. In 1824, he was 78, some 25 years older than Scott. But the two men had known each other for at least a quarter of a century. William Riddle was a member of the Society of the Writers to the Signet, and the men knew each other from Edinburgh legal circles. In 1799, when Scott was trying to become Sheriff of Selkirkshire, he asked for Riddle's endorsement, mentioning in his request the friendship you have always shown me. After 1811, when Scott bought the property that he developed into Abbotsford, the two men also became close neighbours. Riddle had inherited land at Lenthill across the moor, and his own lands at Camiston and Cavers Car were only about 8 miles away. Cavers Car, which Riddle had acquired through marriage, had been remodelled twice during his tenure, giving the men a shared interest in the aggrandising of property. And this gift suggests that they also shared an enthusiasm for antiquities. So initially, I took the gift as indicative of a great friendship between the two men. And I was rather astonished to discover, from a wider trawl through Scott's letters, that actually their relationship was not at all as I'd imagined it. They were not the best of friends, and in fact, Riddle had been an implacable creditor when Scott's younger brother Tom fell into financial difficulties in 1807. There are quite a few choice references to Riddle in the letters, but Scott's subsequent lingering dislike of him is perhaps most apparent from this remark in a letter to the Duke of Buccleuch and Queensberry in April 1819, so 5 years earlier. Writing of a recent illness in which he had been cheered by various visitors, Scott says, "The only unwelcome resurrection was that of old Cammy," that's Riddle, "whose feud with me, or rather dryness, I had well hoped was immortal. But he came jinking over Bowden Moor, with daughters and ponies and God knows what, to look after my precious health. I cannot tolerate that man. It seems to me as if I hated him for things not only past and present, but for some future offence, which is as yet in the womb of fate." Was Riddle's gift of the collection of charters and seals 5 years later some kind of rapprochement? I just don't know, and there's no obvious occasion in 1824 that might have motivated the gift. But the exchange of this item between the two men is very reminiscent of its similar exchange between two other men a century earlier. That transaction is also recorded in the book itself. So now it's time to take a step backwards and look at its earlier owners. One of the gaps in the object's biography that I haven't been able to fill is between 1824, when William Riddle gave it to Walter Scott, and the 1760s or 70s, when it probably came up for sale at auction. I don't know how long it was in Riddle's possession, and I also don't know how or when he came by it. There may well have been intervening owners. but I can pick up the trail in the first decades of the 18th century, thanks to two other inscriptions in the front of the volume. One of these is the name Thomas Martin, and the other records Martin's loan of the book to his friend, Peter Leneve. The inscription in Leneve's handwriting reads, "Mr. Thomas Martin's deeds, to be returned. He hath my note for them. Peter Leneve, Norroy." Peter Leneve was a herald. He was Norroy King of Arms, and he was an early fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. By the time he died in 1729, he'd assembled a vast collection of books and manuscripts, including a large number of historical sources related to Norfolk and Suffolk. Round about 1710, he visited Thetford in Suffolk, where he met Thomas Martin, then a teenager with a precocious interest in local history. Martin and Leneve became friends, and Martin was later Leneve's executor, and he also married his widow. Thomas Martin is very well known to book collectors as Thomas Martin of Palgrave, but his contemporaries called him Honest Tom, possibly ironically, because his marriage to Leneve's widow allowed him to get his hands on all of Leneve's collections, and not everyone was pleased about that. Martin's own signature is on the inside front cover, at the top right. If we just have another look at that slide, it's slightly obscured by a modern label, but it's very distinctive. And you're just seeing part of it there, but it's instantly recognisable as this example of his full signature, which I took from a manuscript in Glasgow University Library. Collectively, Martin's inscription and Leneve's allow us to piece together quite a lot of information. Leneve writes that he's borrowing the object from Martin, promising to return it. That moment of the borrowing must have been between 1710, when the two men met for the first time, and 1729, when Leneve died. And Leneve's inscription tells us something else as well, if we look at that again. This is what he says, and here is where it is. And it's written on the printed page of the book. He doesn't make any mention of the book, he just calls it a set of deeds. But the fact that he wrote on the printed page reveals that the whole object had already been brought together. Before I saw it, and when I first heard about this collection of deeds at Abbotsford, I presumed that it was Scott himself who'd assembled it. But when I saw it, I quickly realised that the object must already have looked like this when it came into his hands. And my hypothesis is that it was Thomas Martin who put it together. Thomas Martin was clearly one of those people who liked sorting things out. He was always rearranging his own collections of things. And in 1724, he was actually employed by Eton College to put their muniments room in order. The fashioning of these deeds into a book-like thing, which facilitates quicker and easier reference, also seems to me the kind of strategy that would have appealed, and indeed occurred, to a man such as Thomas Martin, who wanted historical stuff not just for the thrill of possession, but for its possibilities of use. He intended to write a history of Thetford, and he made his own and Leneve's extensive collections freely available to other researchers. And in terms of opportunity too, Thomas Martin seems the best placed person to have been able to bring these items together. They're things of very disparate origins. Martin was a great buyer of stuff in the locality of Thetford, over on the left here. Thetford is only 9 miles west of Garbaldersham, noted in the centre. And Garbaldersham is the central point of reference of the charter collection, so it's probably in that vicinity that the collection of charters survived. Martin's later move to Palgrave, right over there on the right, kept him equally close to that area. I assume that he bought the book, the printed book, second hand, and although I don't know exactly where he got it from, there is some ground for thinking that he might have found it in another nearby place, in Freckenham. So Thetford now is in the centre with the blue arrow, and there's Palgrave still over there on the right. Freckenham, your eyes would have to be really, really good to make out the place names, but Freckenham is over there on the left with the red arrow. So, why do I think I got it from here? Well, hidden away at the very back of the book, and totally unnoticed by anyone until my visit to Abbotsford last spring, is a third clue to the book's life history. On the inside back cover, a nice clear italic hand has written Bridget Russell, her book. I don't suppose Bridget to have had much interest in medieval charters, though I might be wrong. So I assume when she wrote her book, she meant the printed prose romance book, a tragi-comical history of our times, which was actually very typical of the kind of thing that 17th century women might have read for pleasure. If I'm right in that, then Bridget Russell owned this book when it was still just a regular book for reading, before it was dismembered and recycled to organise the collection of medieval deeds. And that means she would have owned it prior to Thomas Martin. So I looked for a woman called Bridget Russell in the vicinity of the Norfolk-Suffolk border between 1635, when the book was printed, and the 1720s, when I know Thomas Martin had it. And I found one who seems to be quite a plausible candidate. Bridget Russell and her husband Robert Russell are named in documents that relate to a legal dispute about the manor of Freckenham in the 1670s. Bridget, I've shown you a little skeleton family tree there. Bridget was the daughter of Sir Thomas Soame, who was Lord of the Manor of Freckenham and Sheriff of London in 1635. He was also a Member of Parliament before the Civil War. When Thomas Soame died in 1670, he left his property to his 2 daughters, Bridget and Cicely. Cicely conveyed her share of the lordship to her brother-in-law, Robert Russell. But her will was disputed by her second husband, Thomas Cage, giving rise to a suit in Chancery, Russell versus Cage, which was only resolved a decade later. This Bridget Russell, who was married by the 1670s and who had connections in Suffolk and London, seems well placed to have been able to acquire a book like this, and likely to have had the level of education required to read it and to write in it. Her inscription of her name on its inside back cover shows that the book was already bound when it came into Thomas Martin's hands, and the style of its plain brown calf covers fits with this dating. And of course, if you think about it, the printed book must have been bound before the deeds were inserted, because otherwise the structure wouldn't have had the physical strength to support the collection. So, with a few assumptions, I composite this timeline for the book object's history. Thomas Martin's collections were sold partly in the 1760s when he was short of cash, and mostly in the 1770s after his death in 1771. These lots from the 4-day sale in 1774 of what's described as the remaining part of his collection of manuscripts, books, deeds, grants, drawings, prints and coins give an indication of the staggering amount of stuff that he collected. Some other items in this sale catalogue also made their way, eventually, to Scotland. 2 Chaucer manuscripts are listed, one a copy of the Canterbury Tales, and the other Chaucer's translation of the Roman de la Rose. And both of those were bought by William Hunter, who bequeathed his library to Glasgow University. The entries in the sale catalogue for those Chaucer manuscripts are full of descriptive details which allow them to be identified very securely. But the deeds and charters were far too numerous to list individually or even as batches. Over a couple of pages in the sale catalogue, there are 31 bundles of deeds and charters, and they're mostly just totted up and marked ditto. There's one full entry there, and then a whole lot of others. 48 Suffolk original deeds which were never published, valuable either on account of antiquity, curious seals setting forth the old knights and gentry, lords of manors, patrons of livings, rectors and vicars, etc., collected by Mr. Leneve and Martin at great expense. And then the next entry, 66, ditto, 77, ditto, 64, ditto, 58, ditto, and so on. And there's another page of that afterwards. Now, none of those entries exactly matches the Abbotsford collection, but there might easily have been errors in counting in the pressure to get everything listed for sale, and I believe this still happens. The description of the collection in the catalogue of the Advocates' Library isn't accurate either. It describes Scott's curious collection as a collection of old seals between 60 and 70, attached to parchment instruments. That description follows one given in the 19th century catalogue of Scott's library, and it gives a very interesting insight into what was thought at that time to be the object's main element of interest, and that was the seals rather than the documents themselves. In point of fact, there are actually 106 documents in the collection, and so we've reached the point now where we can finally consider the medieval elements of the book. So the very first of these 106 charters is undated, which is quite common for early charters. But the second one is dated 1291. The penultimate charter is dated 1418, and the final one was also written during the reign of Henry V. So they span 3 centuries, and they've been arranged in chronological order. They vary in size from quite small, as you can see, to larger documents that need to be folded to fit into the frame of the book. Most of these documents would originally have had dependent seals, many of which are now missing. 1 or 2 seals are detached, but still present. Several of the documents have multiple seals. I think 4 is the largest number that I've seen on any single charter. And most of the seals are made of green wax, which was the colour predominantly used in this period by all seal users who were not royal. And the collection includes some indentures or chirographs. These are very distinctive documents because of their zigzag edges. The idea was that A single document written in 2 parts was cut in 2 across the middle, and each party to the contract took a half. Should there be any dispute about authenticity, this could easily be proved by matching up the 2 halves. But because the 2 halves went in 2 different directions, it's very, very rare to find both halves of an indenture surviving in the same archive. But that's exactly what we have here. To check this, I photographed 2 documents, and then I printed out the photographs and I cut them up and nervously put them together to make sure that they would fit. And the first time they didn't, and then I went back and saw that I got the resolution of the 2 photographs not quite right. So I had a moment of disappointment. But you can see that they fit together, and you can see that the writing that was originally written across the place where it was cut matches perfectly. Books that were oddly composed and oddly shaped, like this one, challenge all the systems designed to classify and store them, and where to keep this hybrid object always seems to have been something of a conundrum. In Walter Scott's time, according to his own handwritten catalogue, this item was apparently kept in his study in Press D, Shelf 1, but subsequently it was kept in the library table, as indicated by 2 separate notes at the front of the volume. The current archivist at Abbotsford told me that the library table is the map table, so this large piece of furniture over here, in which charters were also kept and which, she says, contained many secret compartments. This book couldn't be kept on a shelf unless it was laid flat, like an oversized book, but it doesn't lay flat either. It's one of those things that just doesn't fit neatly into an organisational scheme, because it's essentially unlike most other objects of its kind. And its mixed nature makes it a challenge, both to interpret and also to look after. From an archival perspective, and I know there are a couple of archivists in the room, this object is a horrendous prospect. Parchment changes shape if the environment is too hot and dry, and that places strain on the places where parchment and paper are joined together. Seals are very fragile, and they're liable to damage any time the object is moved. Turning the pages of this book is quite a challenge, the more so as you get deeper into the volume. When I looked at this at Abbotsford, I almost didn't bother going all the way to the back, because I got the measure of what the object was and realised that all the charters were English, not Scottish, and so on. And it was only a kind of desire for thoroughness that made me get the archivist to flip the book over so I could start going at it from the back. And that's how I found the Bridget Russell inscription, and I suspect that's why no one else has ever found it before. From a modern perspective, this method of preserving a collection of charters would not be a recommended one, and it's not how they were kept in the Middle Ages either. In their own day, charters and books were kept in boxes or in chests. The chest was portable and lockable, and things within it were protected from rodents and kept relatively free from damp. Most ordinary charters, just regular documents that recorded local land and other legal transactions, are small, and they're smaller still when they're folded up. Folding protects the fragile seals because they can be tucked inside, and it preserves the written text from casual water damage. And when folded into neat squares, a considerable number of charters can be fitted into a small wooden box, like this one. Their contents are very easily recognisable from summaries written on their backs. This method of housing charters was one that prioritised safe and long preservation. A charter was really important evidence. It was proof of title and ownership. It might sometimes have to be produced many years, even centuries later. So in the meantime, safekeeping was the order of the day. The method of organising the Abbotsford collection of deeds wasn't devised for the same purpose. Yes, the shell of the printed book provides a measure of protection. It keeps the charters all bound together, and it shelters them between sturdy boards. But this method of housing the charters also has the effect of turning the charters into a book. That is, it transforms them into a collection that can be more quickly read if you're not an archivist bothered by the seals clattering about all the time. You can get through these charters faster, just like turning the pages of a book. To read folded charters, you have to unfold each one, you have to flatten it, hold it down with weights because parchment that's been folded will spring back on itself. And then once you've finished, you have to fold it back together in the proper way with the seal tucked inside and return the charter to the box. So sometimes, if the charter's a large one, that's like wrestling with an Ordnance Survey map or a large broadsheet newspaper. All of that is laborious and awkward and time-consuming, and modern researchers can escape that now by using digital copies and reading on screen. Early modern scholars made their own transcriptions or copies of medieval charters, partly to have the ease of a copy that could be consulted more easily. Antiquaries with large collections such as Peter Leneve and Thomas Martin also had storage issues to manage. And Thomas Martin's solution in this instance seems to have been to create a kind of pre-modern ring binder out of a redundant book as a way of keeping this set of related documents together and also making them relatively easy to leaf through. I don't know if this was his own idea or if he copied practices that were used by other contemporary antiquaries in 18th century East Anglia. Suffolk Record Office seems to have another object that's rather like the Abbotsford Book of Deeds. This is a scrapbook collection of documents related to Rumborough Priory. This is Rumborough Priory Church, which is located not very far from Palgrave. And you'll have to content yourself with this picture because I've not managed to go to Suffolk Record Office yet, so I haven't actually seen this object and I don't have any pictures of it. So I can only tell you about it from catalogue descriptions. And from those descriptions, it doesn't sound quite the same. It seems to be more of a scrapbook, where a large blank notebook provides the supporting structure. And it's clearly smaller because it only has 58 separate documents within it, and only one of those has an attached seal. But even with those differences, it still invites comparisons with the Abbotsford object. The Rumborough notebook was owned by another antiquary, Craven Ord. They all have wonderful names, these antiquaries. And since Ord bought many items from Thomas Martin, or from the sale of Martin's library, I think the Rumborough materials could well have come from Martin as well, and might originally have been assembled by him too. There might have been a vogue for constructing such charter books in 18th century East Anglia, or it might have been an idiosyncratic practice followed by Thomas Martin alone. I might be able to work out the truth of this once I've been to Suffolk and I've seen this Rumborough object, or if I can track down more examples of such mixed media types of objects. So that's a matter for ongoing research. But even if more objects like this do come to light, that won't diminish the curiosity of this one, nor the interest of its connection with its last private owner, Sir Walter Scott. Thank you very much for listening.
Are you ready to answer this?
If anyone has any questions, yes.
Have you explored any further how it might have got to Scotland in the first place? I think you mentioned the Martin Sale, someone buying Chaucer manuscripts. Was it William Hunter?
That was William Hunter.
Yes. Who is he? And is it related to with the man who was Archibald Constable's partner, who was also called Hunter, I think?
I don't know about the latter.
Yeah.
William Hunter was an 18th century doctor, physician. He was a royal physician. He was based in London. As well as being interested in medical things, he was also a great collector of other things. But he was a native of Glasgow, and when he died, he bequeathed his library, which was very considerable. The Hunterian. Yes, now you know him. Yes. So we know a lot about Hunter's collections.
Yeah.
What I've not yet found, because I'm not at the end of this research, is I have not yet found the kind of the golden ticket of antiquarian research, which is a marked up sale catalogue which would show who bought things at a particular sale. They do sometimes survive. So I have no idea where those collections of Martins went to or who bought them. It would be wonderful to find that a fairly youthful William Riddle had bought the thing. But I suspect there were some intervening stages. And that's one of the gaps that I haven't been able to fill just yet. I don't know what brought it north of the border.
Had it been Hunter, he'd have hung on to it, I think. He hung on to everything, didn't he?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now that you've set the hair running, possibly would our cousins in the south be interested in getting a copy digital for their scholarship about 600 years late to get their own records back? There might be, I don't know if Abbotsford wants to, is it like the Elgin Marbles, you know, they might set a claim on it. But how would you broadcast the added value that you're now giving to that rather bunch of almost very, very inaccessible, meaningless things until you look into it? But you get a Latinist, medievalist out there, quickly translated to Can.
Yes.
Get it down to England and say, now what would you bid for? I don't suppose you'd be allowed to, but would that set the scholarship next line going?
I've been hoping to find a student at St Andrews who would like to work on the charters. One of the things that I do is teach paleography to a lot of medieval studies and medieval history students. And there's really, there's enough material in this collection for a discrete PhD topic on Norfolk. They are Norfolk, it's the very, very southern border of Norfolk. And because Martin lived in Suffolk, I'm always imagining that these are really Suffolk charters, but it's the bottom end of Norfolk. I have to say, quite aside from English historians being interested in this East Anglian trove, and I'm sure they would be, when this collection first came to light at Abbotsford in 2016, I think, it was one of my colleagues in St Andrews, Katie Stevenson, who was alerted to it, and she told my husband, who's a Scottish historian, he's Michael Brown, who's Professor of Scottish History in St Andrews, and he was very excited because he thought it was going to be a collection of Scottish medieval charters. And his interest lasted for about 5 minutes when he discovered that it was just East Anglian ones, because of course there are a lot more medieval English charters surviving and a lot fewer. And if this had been a collection of 106 charters from medieval Scotland, that would have been a find that would have really interested Scottish historians. So to him and to my Scottish history colleagues, it's a great disappointment, I'm afraid. But I find it very fascinating.
Tom Mole of the bibliographical lot will give a spot in the Quakers Meeting House next year if you've got any more findings on that score.
Okay.
I just wondered if Walter Riddle Carr at Caves Carr had any records that would have thrown light on your studies.
I don't know yet, actually. I've not found out very much about him yet. I'd like to know more. So mostly I've looked through Scott's published letters for all the references to him that I could find. And the next stage would be to look at him a bit more directly, I think. Yes, it would be great to know more about him and his interests. I presume, actually, I mean, this gathering tonight is actually quite similar, I think, to a gathering that might have taken place in the 18th century of people interested in this kind of material. And I think people were interested in collecting. Yes, someone like Hunter is a kind of top drawer collector, I suppose, and had extensive collections. But I think other people of more humble means were also interested in having stuff and preserving it, and gradually that stuff makes its way into public libraries and archives. But I think in that period it was lots of individuals who were genuinely interested in history and in old things and rescuing them. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on the networks, the personal connections between people, and those moments of traffic where someone, Riddle was Scott's neighbour, for some reason he chose to give this thing to Scott. And there's one word that Scott uses. He says he thanks him for transferring it. And I don't know if that indicates that it's something that Riddle had had for a long time and Scott had admired, and finally Riddle had decided to give it to him. Or if he just used this transfer as, you know, just a regular gift-giving verb, I don't know. Yes?
There were two things I wondered about. One is in the advocate's description, was it the number of charters, or was it in fact the number of seals? Because it says seals, 50
Yes.
to 60.
Yes.
And perhaps that is the number of those.
I'm really, really interested that you mentioned that, because actually, just as I was voicing that thought occurred to me tonight, and it's never occurred to me before, because I'd focused on the fact that it mentioned the seals rather than the documents. And I was intrigued by, I think I showed it in capitals, it's like that in the catalogue. That was clearly the thing that they were interested in. But actually, just as I was saying it, I suddenly thought, maybe that indicates that a lot of seals were already missing when Scott got it, and that only what was counted up were the seals and not the documents. So I'm really interested that you also
Well, that was what I
had that thought. Yeah.
The other thing that interested me in particular, you said that they were all in the right order.
Yes.
But that was quite a task, wasn't it?
Yeah. But I guess if you like sorting things out, you put things in order. I mean, some people like
Did they
to
make any mistakes?
Not that I've spotted. I'll have to check all my dates, because sometimes reading the dates on medieval documents is quite a challenge, because they don't tend to put 1390. They put the 17th year of the reign of Richard II of that name since the conquest, etc. And they use Roman numerals, so you can get that thing wrong quite easily. But as far as I can tell, they're all ordered chronologically.
Someone must be very clever then.
Yes, I think so.
Can I just pick up on that? If this is a research tool that was being put together by your Thomas Martin, he could read the charters. He was putting the documents in order. He was compiling the book. Did he ever write the history of those parishes? Have you found anything printed where the transcription of the titles might actually be in print?
No, I haven't. Not yet. As you know, Rachel and I teach paleography together, and we sometimes set things for assessment and then have to change our mind because a transcription turned up somewhere, and a bit of Googling would give our students a very easy task. So it's quite possible that in some obscure 19th century or 18th
County
century,
history or something,
yes,
yeah.
there might be transcriptions, but
That would be part of the PhD project.
yeah, exactly.
That'd be great.
Okay. I don't want to pour cold water on the object, but I'm very interested in the way in which the relationship between Scott and Biddle is expressed by Scott, and in this giving of a gift that might not actually have been worth a lot. East Anglian charters from the Middle Ages are 2 a penny. They still are. I've got one.
There are lots of them.
There are lots and lots and lots of these things. And the way that they're expressed in all those lists in the catalogues, just another lot of that old stuff.
Yes.
As if Martin was one of these magpies who collected anything
Yes.
that he could get his hands
Yeah.
on. And then could Biddle have bought it in a lot and ended up with something he wanted and
And not
something
this
that he
thing.
didn't want.
Oh, that's very
And
interesting.
That's a good idea.
Tossed it at Scott.
Yes.
who,
Like that sort of thing.
who possibly liked that sort of thing, or may just have tossed it in a drawer and so
Forgot
it's
about it.
still there.
That's an
Because,
interesting angle, Pam.
We just valorise things because of their age,
Yes.
but there are some things, like a lot of the content of that aren't really, in terms of medieval materials, worth very much at all.
But people did like seals
Yes,
in the 19th century,
yes, that's true.
and they tended to sort of cut them off and
Yes.
mount them.
Yes, there's no seal on my chart.
No, I think it was like stamp collecting, really.
Yeah.
Yes, and you took the stamps off the letters. So here you take the seals
Seal off.
Yes.
of the charter. Yeah.
I do not want to keep people from their wine and canapes, but I'm very, very happy to talk to people individually if you have other questions.
I've got a tail end one. Is that the Palgrave, famous for the place or printworks of Palgrave Golden Treasury? You know, that's a Palgrave.
That's a person, I think. That's a person. But I don't know if he had any connection or derivation from Palgrave. That's possible. I just don't know. Palgrave Macmillan, still a publisher.
Tends to be names, doesn't it?
Margaret, thank you very much. Louise Gardner's going to give both thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Well, splendid, Margaret, is all I can say. What a story. It's very interesting. I think I heard a bit of this story before, and I have been to Abbotsford to look at this object. And I must admit that the first time I went straight past it, which was astonishing because this was what I'd come to see. Because it's actually quite small. It's only about that big, and it's very grey and obviously old, so probably covered in soot at various stages, and it just looks like nothing very attractive, I must admit. The photographs look much better. So thank you so much for resurrecting this thing, which, yes, may not have been worth a lot, may not look very attractive, but we now have a story, a real story. And even though it doesn't seem to appear in any of Walter Scott's stories, the stories that he wrote, he doesn't seem to mention an object like that, which he might have done, being him. It was very, very much, I think, the sort of object he liked. And it was therefore also very much an object to talk about for the Walter Scott Club, because we have an astonishing range of things that people talk about, all somehow connected with Walter Scott. And this one, I think, was a particularly suitable one because it takes us across centuries, it takes us to different geographical areas, and you can just see it's the sort of thing that Walter Scott would have loved. So thank you very, very much for introducing us to it, and of course for all your wonderful research that brings meaning to this object, which really doesn't look like very much when you first see it. Thank you.